In the early years of the PlayStation, extreme sports titles were quite rare in many cases, as the genre and even the sport itself was still yet to really become popular or explode with regards to the concept in general, which would take a few years later on towards the end of the 90s and early 2000s where it would really come into a league of its own. But it still didn't stop developers from trying to incorporate many ideas, some of which would also help to produce even more popularity and get more eyes on this unique concept of games and even just the sport in general. And we had games earlier on in the system with the likes of ESPN Extreme Games, but in 1996 we also had Cool Borders, which would be the first in a popular series of games, 5 of them of which would actually be released on the PlayStation itself. But this first entry, dating back to 1996 itself, was first released in Japan and then was later added to other regions later that year. That sees you take on the role of different characters with their own traits and abilities to race in different game modes, time trials and tournaments across 3 different types of courses, with each player attempting to gain the fastest possible times while performing tricks to acquire the most amount of points possible. And again, this game came out at a time when extreme sports was still not as well known, but this game in many ways did help to popularise the sport, but also the actual genre itself, especially later on with seeing more games, sequels and other developers trying to capitalise on these trends. And while it was a good first attempt, the game did receive mixed reviews, many stating that the game was enjoyable, but the lack of 2-player or multiplayer support and some of the inherent glitches and features and bizarre physics, seeing characters getting caught against barriers and ricocheting like a pinball in between various assets and objects, and many cases that would see the game glitch out to a point that the player would end up sliding uphill rather than downhill. So it left a feeling that the game just felt somewhat unfinished upon its release, but that would later be rectified with future sequels. But with each sequel moving forward, there would be a drastic change in how the game looked and felt and even played. The first 2 games in the series, Cool Borders 1 and the second game, had more of an arcade approach to the experience, whereas later games tried to go for more realistic approach with even more detailed visuals that completely moved away from that visual style and aesthetic. But in many ways, the later sequels, while they were decent in some regards, just didn't have that character or vibe that the original 2 games had, and in some ways felt very sluggish in how they played, as it didn't have the same pick up or play appeal compared to the first 2 games. But aside from the game's inherent flaws, it was considered as a good first attempt for snowboarding games on the PlayStation that presented many unique challenges and addictive qualities. But I think the game is more known for its goofy style flaws. I think that's what people relate to it the most, but I suppose that was its unique trait in many ways. And for its time, even regardless of the reviews, it still got decent reviews across the board. If that had to been the case where it was released later on, it wouldn't have had the same approach. I think it was just a case of timing. Going back to even earlier extreme sports games with the likes of ESPN, while it didn't age as well, it came out at quite possibly the perfect time for the PlayStation during the first few months of the console's release, at a time when games were in that transition between 2D and 3D, and even in 1996 that was still going on. It was just a unique time for games. So even though games were initially flawed, they did appeal to quite a number of fans, even brought new fans into the arena of different types of genres, because they presented something that nobody at that time, or very few at that time, had ever seen before. And even though they had their glitches and they had their gripes, they definitely stood out because they were just different compared to everything else that was out there, in fairness. So it really was a case of timing, as these games also helped, like I said, to help evolve and grow popularity of the PlayStation, but even the extreme sports genre in general, which you would later see later on in the 90s and early 2000s with a ridiculous amount of these style of games being released on consoles moving forward, as the early periods of the 2000s became dominant for extreme sports across the world. So it was inevitable that tons of video games were going to capitalise on that trend, and the PlayStation definitely took full advantage of that. But in many ways we have the original Cool Borders and even ESPN Extreme Games to thank for that process. So even looking back over the game, you have 3 tracks, because it does have an arcade approach to it. And when we look at the arcade style of it, while it is very different to other types of games, essentially it is a racing game in many respects. And during this period, many arcade games, if we look at even racing games for example, with the likes of more predominantly Ridge Racer which pretty much set that standard for the arcade aesthetic, even like the Sega Rally. All of these games always had a limited amount of courses available to them. They might have had maybe one course and different variations or different areas that you could explore, maybe due to different difficulties. And Cool Borders has that aesthetic. You have 3 courses, but each one corresponds to a different difficulty of the game. So the more you get into it, the harder each course becomes. So it really becomes down to persistence, skill, and just sheer luck in order to win events, gain the most amount of points, and also just to finish in the quickest possible times. The only downside with this game that would later be rectified in sequels is that you were the only one on the course throughout the entire experience, and that's what made the overall game feel somewhat limited, as you had nobody else racing with you on the screen to provide that extra additional challenge. But the game was challenging enough because it would take a lot of time and patience, and you had to be very, very good with the button presses and your reflexes in order to really have a chance of completing races, especially on the harder tracks, or the last track in the game. That was definitely the hardest one because there were so many quick turns and twists and jumps, and in many ways the camera wouldn't necessarily follow you, so you'd actually get stuck against the walls or bounce off a part of the environment that would completely throw you off, so it'd leave you trying to figure out where you needed to go. So there was always that element to it as well. There was always a level of unpredictability with every experience that you had with the game. And while it may not have aged well when you really think about it compared to other games, it definitely has that arcade vibe and style which it was going for, and I think that it executes it very well. It just is a game that reflects its time when it was released, and it really suits it for what it's trying to do. Overall, it's a fun game. It's not the best snowboarder on the PlayStation, far from it actually, but when you really think about it, if this game didn't exist, we wouldn't have the plethora of other extreme sport or snowboarder games that you would have seen on the PlayStation or the consoles. This game in many ways helped to pave the way for a lot of those other titles to exist. So for that reason alone, it is interesting to go back to this game and play it again, just to compare it to other titles, or even just to relive it if you are a fan of the game, which I would love to know your experiences on Cool Borders if you have played it yourself. And what do you think of this series of games overall? Which was the game in the series that got you into playing extreme sports games? Was it this game or any of the other sequels that followed? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other extreme sports games that were also released on the system that I have covered in previous videos, then you can check out the playlist on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.